Day. Today is 30th April, last day in April 2024, and another day both in the conflict in Ukraine and in what is now, I think, increasingly clear, the great global conflict that is taking place between the United States and its allies, the so-called consolidated West, and, well, who exactly? Because it's beginning to appear to me, at least, as if the list of enemies or apparent enemies is growing all the time and is doing so at an accelerating rate and will soon include, or so it seems to me, most of the rest of the world. Obviously, Russia is an enemy. We'll come to the conflict in Ukraine shortly. After Secretary Blinken's disastrous trip to China, it's clear that China is also an enemy, and this, of course, has been apparent to many of us for quite a long time, and I've talked about it in my various programs, and we've talked about it on the Duran, going back basically to the time when the Duran first started. But it's starting to look as if India might soon become an enemy as well. I'm reading one article after another now in the media, the Western media, the British media especially, but also I gather there have been quite a few in the American media, which have also been highlighting the transgressions, some real, some imagined, I suspect, on the part of Prime Minister Modi and his government in India. There's increasing doubts or being expressed about the legitimacy of Prime Minister Modi's election. There's a long article about this in The Guardian yesterday, and all kinds of criticisms of Prime Minister Modi and of the way in which he's supposedly whipping up Hindu nationalist fervor in order to win an election which supposedly is going against him and which he is increasingly desperate to win. Now, I have to say, the last goes diametrically against all the claims I've been reading about the Indian election for some time. These, on the contrary, have said that Prime Minister Modi is heading towards an unstoppable landslide. But who knows, perhaps things on the ground are different from what I believe. But anyway, one way or the other, it's becoming clear that increasing numbers of people in the West, people in high and senior positions, are very unhappy with Prime Minister Modi and are already preparing for the day when, after he is re-elected, which for the moment nobody doubts, the United States and its allies will finally confront him. So India, it seems, is also an adversary. Brazil, it appears, is becoming an adversary too. The ANC government in South Africa, also an adversary, facing apparently a difficult election, but universally expected nonetheless that the ANC will emerge from the election as the biggest party. We shall see, and form a government. We shall also see, but if it does, apparently it too will be an adversary. And Niger, West Africa, tussle about whether or not US troops are actually leaving Niger or not. I'm not going to get into the details of all of that, but anyway, it looks as if Niger wants the US troops in Niger out. The State Department has agreed. The Pentagon is dragging its feet. Anyway, it does look as if in West Africa, at least, more and more West African countries are unhappy with the general situation, with the relationship, the long-standing relationship with the West. And of course, in the Asia-Pacific region, continued attempts to draw dividing lines between the West and China. So the Philippines, or to be more precise, I'm not sure whether he represents general feeling in the Philippines, but anyway, President Marcos Jr. now on side, just as President Milei in Argentina is now on side, so they're not our enemies. But increasing signs that the Vietnamese, Vietnam, and even Indonesia might not be seen as reliable any longer. And who knows, they might at some point be enemies too. Anyway, it is an astonishing situation globally. This attempt by the United States and the collective West to continue to assert their global dominance. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson actually gave an interview in which he openly said that the war in Ukraine, if it's lost, will be a blow against US hegemony, which is a remarkable observation to make. But anyway, there we go. So, major conflict taking place around the world, unwanted, by the way, by most people, creating massive disruption with supply chains, economic activities, unraveling globalization, but there it is. Anyway, before I begin this program, and on this topic of the growing rivalries between the US and its friends and those who it chooses to see as its enemies, we've had some rather interesting information about President Xi Jinping's forthcoming visit to Europe. Bloomberg has a piece today saying that President Xi is coming with the intention of creating dividing lines in Europe against the United States. He's trying to divide Europe from the United States. Of course, no Chinese official, and certainly not President Xi, has ever said anything of the sort. And I'm going to say something else. I don't think what we now know about President Xi's itinerary, the countries that he's intending to visit, actually suggests that the three countries he's going to visit are Hungary, Serbia, and France. Hungary and Serbia, according to the mindset of Western officials, or at least neocon officials, those obviously are enemies. I mean, it's hardly disputed any longer, and all you have to do is read the media in the West to see that this is so. The only country, in other words, in Europe, in other words, which Xi Jinping is visiting, which is not going to be on the list of enemies, is France. But France is seen as unreliable. Its president, Emmanuel Macron, sometimes says one thing, sometimes says another. He at times gives the impression that he's chafing at US dominance and wants to rebel against it. At other times, he takes the most extreme pro-US and pro-Western positions. So maybe Xi Jinping, who has had productive meetings with President Macron in the past, still hopes that he can somehow get President Macron to see reason and to build up a relationship with the Western power, the Western country, France, which I believe was the first to establish diplomatic relations amongst the Western states with the People's Republic of China. But anyway, we'll see what comes of that. But it doesn't seem to me as if President Xi is aiming to divide Europe collectively from the United States. On the contrary, what he seems to be doing, or so it seems to me, is buttressing the position of China's existing friends, specifically Hungary and Serbia, which are coming under intense Western pressure. And that in itself is, of course, a sign of how divided and conflicted the modern world has become. Anyway, let's move on and let's go back to that conflict, which is at the center of everything, where this great struggle is playing out. And that, of course, is the conflict in Ukraine. And we've had a whole cascade of further news last night and this morning about the battlefield situation. And I think it's straightforward to say that pretty much all of it is bad for Ukraine. The first is that there has been an exchange of missile strikes. The Russians launched missile strikes against Odessa, significant missile strikes against Odessa. This is over and above the missile strikes and drone strikes that the Russians now conduct right across the whole of Ukraine, pretty much every night now. The Russians, by the way, and for the record, are continuing to launch major artillery, missile and bomb strikes on positions around Kharkov. We will come to that soon. But anyway, there was another major missile strike on Odessa. One of these missile strikes targeted a kind of fairy tale castle-like building on the coast. Probably, I would say, the creation of some Tsarist official or business person in the late 19th, early 20th century, before the Russian Revolution. There were several such buildings created. You can find them also in the Crimean Peninsula, by the way. But anyway, this particular building was targeted. It seems probably not by an Iskander missile. A reasonable guess might be an Onyx missile launched from Crimea. This is a supersonic anti-ship missile, which does have also a capability to carry out attacks on ground targets. Anyway, it seems that this building housed some kind of military training center or military school. We're not being told very much about it. But anyway, whatever, there was a big missile strike on Odessa. There was also a very big Ukrainian missile strike on Crimea. And we're told by our old friend Vladimir Saldo, the head of the Kherson regional government. Of course, this is the Russian-oriented Kherson regional government, that this attack also involved ATACMS missiles. Now, we haven't yet been provided with any information about the success or otherwise of this strike, but the way that Saldo told it, it seems as if the strike was unsuccessful. Well, we'll see. We'll probably get more information over the course of the next few hours. All of this suggests that the West, the United States, Ukraine, are testing out their missiles, specifically the ATACMS missiles, preparing for that major strike to come, which is the strike against the Crimean Bridge. And I noticed that Saldo gave a specific warning and piece of advice. He said that he asked commentators, people from the ground, or the ordinary public, in other words, in Kherson region and in Crimea, not to publish photographs or provide information which might help Ukraine and the Western powers identify the location of Russian air defense units. And again, that perhaps points to the purpose of the strike, which is basically to smoke out where the Russian air defense units are, the better to try to circumvent them, or perhaps to specifically attack them in advance of the strike on the bridge itself. Now, one thing I would say, and this is me, I'm not certain about this, I might be completely wrong, is that of course the more ATACMS missiles Ukraine launches, the better the Russians get to know this missile, the more it becomes possible for them to develop countermeasures to enhance the programming of their air defense missiles, to get a grasp of the attack and missiles characteristics, and to develop an effective air defense to it. So I can see the logic of these strikes for the time being, but of course if they drag on for too long, they might in the end be counterproductive. But I presume that the Americans and the Ukrainians understand this, and that probably points, in fact, all the indications are that we are going to see the major strike on the Crimean Bridge take place at some point over the course of the next few days. Anyway, that's one part of what is going on the battlefronts. But on the ground, the situation is becoming more and more critical for Ukraine. Now, again, the epicenter is the Ocheretino-Avdiivka area, but for the record, we've just received another report, another further claim that the Russians now control either the whole or the greater part of Rabotino. This village, fiercely contested village during Ukraine's famous offensive of the summer, the one that failed and was defeated disastrously. The Ukrainians were expecting to capture Rabotino on the first day of their offensive. Well, it took them 2 months to get close to doing that. It's unclear to me whether they ever fully consolidated control over it. But anyway, they did have some troops there. The Russians went back on the offensive in the Zaporozhye area some months ago. That led to fierce fighting for Rabotino. There have been various claims at various times that the Russians have captured this village, but on each occasion, those claims have turned out to be untrue. There are claims today, there are, in fact, photographs today, which show Russian flags at various points, apparently, inside this village. That does suggest that the Russians do indeed control at least the greater part of Rabotino. But anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, I want to repeat a point I made weeks ago when the renewed fighting for Rabotino began, which is that I do not understand why the Ukrainians are defending this village, why Zelensky himself went to Rabotino to speak to the Ukrainian soldiers there and to advise them to hang on. It makes absolutely no sense to me. Rabotino was never under any sort of Ukrainian control before late August 2023. It therefore is not an important part of Ukraine's defense system. Whatever Ukraine achieved in Rabotino, in the area around it last summer and in the early autumn, has proved completely ephemeral. The Ukrainians were never able to capitalize on their advances in this particular village. Their great offensive towards Tokmak, as we know, was a complete failure, and they never got anywhere close to denting the massive Russian fortified lines in this area. So I just do not understand why the Ukrainians have been fighting to defend their positions in this village. It makes no sense to me at all. Recently, there were reports that the Ukrainians had reassigned the 116th Brigade, which is one of the units that was defending positions in this area, to the more important area of Novomikhailivka, which has just been captured by the Russians. Maybe that has weakened the Ukrainian positions around Rabotino, and it is why the Russians have apparently been able to capture either the whole village or the greater part of it. But to be clear, when we talk about Rabotino, we're not talking about a village any longer. Pictures that I've seen of it show a blasted landscape. There is hardly a building left standing. And those buildings which have been destroyed are completely flattened. So I have no idea what the Ukrainians think they're defending, why they are sacrificing the lives of valuable troops trying to defend this place. It makes absolutely no sense to me. What they're doing, it seems to me, plays instead directly into the policy of aggressive attrition that the Russians have been following in Zaporozhye region, in other places, right across the front lines. But anyway, that's the big news. If you follow the Telegram channels this morning, I don't consider it particularly big news. To me, it looks like a sideshow, but then what do I know? The big news continues to be what is happening around Ocheretino and Krasnogorovka. Let me first of all talk about the situation in Krasnogorovka. This is this fortified town which the Russians have been storming for several weeks now. It lies between Marinka to the south, which the Russians fully captured in December, and Avdiivka to the north, which the Russians captured in February. It's a town of about 14,000 people before the war. It has several factories and industrial buildings. It is heavily fortified. It was a key part of the defense line, or if you like, maybe the siege line that the Ukrainians created around Donetsk city in 2014 and 2015. Other parts of that defense line have collapsed, have been captured by the Russians, notably Marinka and Avdiivka, but the Ukrainians still hold at least part of Krasnogorovka. Well, I said some weeks ago that once Pervomaisky fell, Ukrainian position in Krasnogorovka would become incredibly precarious. And I wondered again, and not for the first time, whether the Ukrainians might decide to withdraw from Krasnogorovka in light of that. Well, of course, they haven't. On the contrary, they've been trying to send reinforcements to try to defend their positions in this town. Again, I completely fail to see the logic of this. To me, looking at a map, seeing Krasnogorovka sandwiched between Avdiivka and Marinka, both under Russian control, looking at Russian positions in Pervomaisky and before long in Netalovo, it's clear that Ukrainian positions in Krasnogorovka risk being encircled. But, of course, the Ukrainians, as they always do, President Zelensky, as he always does, insists that Krasnogorovka must be defended to the very last. And though he hasn't visited Krasnogorovka, it's clear that this is his intention with respect to that town. So Ukrainian troops apparently continue to be fed into Krasnogorovka, where they're bombed and shelled by the Russians and no doubt die in large numbers. And by the way, there are reports that alongside the bombs, the FAB bombs that the Russians now regularly drop on Krasnogorovka, alongside the terrifying TOS-1 thermobaric flamethrower multiple launch rocket systems that they've also deployed to Krasnogorovka. They have also deployed the awesome 240 millimeter Tulpan self-propelled mortar, which is specifically designed to destroy fortified positions. I think I'm right in saying that it is the largest caliber artillery piece in service anywhere in the world. And apparently it has been operating to devastating effect in Krasnogorovka. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians defend it, except that today the brigade, the Ukrainian brigade, with the primary responsibility for defending Krasnogorovka, which is the 46th Air Mobile Brigade. The 3rd Assault Brigade, which was at one time also there, has been pulled out. Anyway, the 46th Air Assault Brigade has now apparently published statements to the effect on its website that the situation in Krasnogorovka is becoming desperate, that the Russians are advancing into Krasnogorovka from the northeast, that the situation is close to complete crisis, and that there's apparently, or at least I haven't seen the 46th Air Mobile Brigade's statement, but I've heard about it or read about it. Anyway, there's allegations that there's risks that some of these Ukrainian troops within Krasnogorovka itself could find themselves encircled. And there have been reports also from some of the Russian telegram channels, Slavyangrad specifically, that the Russians have now made significant advances within Krasnogorovka. There's even a claim that they've advanced a full kilometer within the town, which would suggest that the crisis for the Ukrainian troops in Krasnogorovka has now come. If Krasnogorovka collapses within the next few days, if hundreds of Ukrainian troops are taken prisoner there, if some Ukrainian troops are surrounded by the Russians and trapped, as happened in Avdiivka, and if the Ukrainians have to flee from Krasnogorovka across country roads bombed and shelled by the Russians and across fields, exactly as happened in Avdiivka and in other towns. To be absolutely clear, it will be the responsibility of the Ukrainian command, of President Zelensky and General Syrskyi, for once again insisting that Ukrainian troops continue to defend undefendable positions long past the point when it made any sense to ask them to do that. But anyway, that's one battle that is taking place. Perhaps even more dramatic, in fact, definitely even more dramatic, and even more consequential is what is happening now around Ocheretino. Now, before I start on that, I should say that there is some discussion, and it might be correct discussion, about why the Russian Defense Ministry still is not reporting the capture of Ocheretino. And inevitably, that is giving rise to claims, reports, rumors that the Ukrainians might still be holding out in some positions within Ocheretino, specifically on the northeast of Ocheretino, in some of the buildings there and in a dacha community, a cottage community to the northeast of Ocheretino. Now, I'm not in any way disputing this. It could be true. It's not consistent with what some Ukrainian reports have been saying for the last couple of days. There might be other explanations why the Russian Defense Ministry is not yet talking about the Battle of Ocheretino. It's important to remember that during the fighting at Avdiivka, for many weeks, the Russian Defense Ministry stopped publishing any commentaries at all about the fighting in Avdiivka, and the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu subsequently explained that this was a deliberate decision so as not to reveal any information that might be of use to the Ukrainians. So that's another possible explanation why the Russians aren't publishing information about the fighting there. But anyway, the point is that we haven't got total clarity about the situation within Ocheretino itself. I don't think it is of any particular significance myself, but it's possible that there are still some Ukrainian soldiers clinging on to some buildings and cottages to the northeast of Ocheretino. If so, I doubt that they will be able to remain there for very long, and they risk also being surrounded. But anyway, that possibility does at least exist, and I'm not discounting it. I don't know that it's true, by the way, and I want to make that also clear. Anyway, situation in Ocheretino. Let's talk about it, because whether the Ukrainians are present in these buildings and cottages is irrelevant to the larger battle. Now, there are reports this morning, and I think these reports look far more reliable than earlier reports that we've seen, that the Ukrainian defenses in Novokalinovo, the village to the east of Ocheretino, has now fully collapsed, that the Ukrainians have completely pulled out of that village, and that the village of Novokalinovo, which lies immediately to the west of the H20 highway, that Novokalinovo has fallen. There are some claims that the Ukrainians retain a presence in the village of Keramik, immediately to the north of Novokalinovo. This is apparently if this claim is true, this is apparently a force to cover the retreat from Novokalinovo. I have to say that there are also other claims, and these are coming from Ukrainian sources now, that Keramik also has fallen fully under Russian control. Now, as I said, we've had claims like that before, but these look to be rather more substantive and perhaps more reliable. It seems that the Ukrainians are, as one would expect, retreating towards the village of Arkhangelskoye, to the northeast of Ocheretino and northwest of Keramik. And there are some claims that the Ukrainians intend to make a stand at Arkhangelskoye. This is the next place where they intend to create a defense line to bar Russian advances northwards. Now, there is a problem with that, which is that relative to Ocheretino, Arkhangelskoye lies on low ground. So the Russians from Ocheretino can look down at Arkhangelskoye. If the Russians also control Keramik and Novokalinovo, well, I can't realistically see how the Ukrainians would be able to hold out in Arkhangelskoye for very long. But anyway, that's one report. The Russians, in other words, have now consolidated control of the territory to the west of Ocheretino. They control all of the territory between Ocheretino and the H20 road. Now, even more dramatic is news that is coming from the west of Ocheretino, because it looks like the Russians have advanced along the TO51 road, or it might be a railway, I'm not sure. But anyway, they've advanced along this, maybe a railway, and they have now reached the village of Novo Alexandrivka, which is located to the northwest of Ocheretino. And it has been suggested that the Russians, their next major objective, is Novo-Alexandrovka. Now, this is incredibly rapid advance, I should say. The Russians are moving and have been moving in the whole of Avdiivka area at great speed. Another sign, by the way, that Ukrainian defenses are very disorganized. Anyway, if the Russians are indeed poised to storm and capture Novo-Alexandrovka, then of course that creates all kinds of interesting and for the Ukrainians very dangerous possibilities. It could, for example, ultimately lead to an advance towards Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk starts to look much more vulnerable further west, but also, and this is a point which has been made by lots of people now, it positions the Russians within 11 kilometers, apparently, of the main road that passes from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka, which is this village, rather small town, to the west of Chasiv Yar. So it could be that the ultimate Russian objective is to cut this road, and that is even more important for the Russians than taking Pokrovsk itself. Now, the Russians will, of course, if they do retake Novo-Alexandrovka, and one assumes that the Ukrainians will try to defend it, so a difficult battle perhaps awaits us. The Russians do capture Alexandrovka, then other Ukrainian positions start to look extremely vulnerable. There's a village called Sokol, southwest of Ocheretino, which has been where many Ukrainian troops have apparently fled to. I have to say that would probably look fragile. And of course, Novopokrovskove, another village to the south of Sokol, looks vulnerable as well. It looks as if the hole that the Russians have punched through the Ukrainian defense lines is widening. And going back to the capture of Novokalinova and Keramik, and probably the eventual capture of Arkhangelskoye, the Russians are able to capture Novo-Alexandrovka and eventually cut this road. Then that puts them in an even stronger position to threaten both Pokrovsk to the west and simultaneously advance northeastwards towards Konstantinovka, encircling Ukrainian troops close to the Russian-controlled city of Gorlovka, in places like Toretsk and New York, the village of New York. The Russians would be in a strong position to advance along the roads and railways to do that, while simultaneously advancing towards Pokrovsk. We would be looking at the opening stages of the last battle of the end of the battle for Donbass, the big battle for Donbass, which has basically been raging since May 2022, and which has been the epicenter of the fight for the special military operation. So, very dramatic events playing out, and of course, it's not just the case that the Russians are attacking in this direction, fanning out, in other words, from Ocheretino towards the north, towards Arkhangelsk, towards the west, towards Novo-Alexandrovka and Sokol, and towards the east through Keramik and Novokalinova, looking perhaps also to advance up the H20 highway. it looks as if the Russians are also now launching attacks westwards from Berdichi and Semenyovka, which it seems they've also captured, towards another village to the west, Novoselivka Persha. And, well, we've all had seen reports about fighting now going on in Umanske and in Netailovo as well, with the Russians supposedly controlling more of that village of Netailovo. At least some reports say around half of that village. So, as I said, a widening hole, a widening gap in the Ukrainian defense lines, with strong likelihood that the Russians are going to reinforce and are perhaps planning a major offensive in this direction. So, there we go. That's, it seems to me, the single most important news from the battlefronts. There have been reports that the Russians have been making more advances in the Chasov Yar area, that the turtle tanks covered with metal shields have started to appear in the Chasov Yar area as well. I have to say that the reports are very unclear, and I'm not going to spend any time there. The key point is that the micro-district east of the canal is basically cut off from reinforcement. The Russians are bombing it relentlessly. The Russian pincers around Chasov Yar are tightening. But it looks to me as if possibly, in order to understand the battle at Chasov Yar, we need to also understand what's playing out around Ocheretino. It could be that what the Russians are really planning is some kind of more ambitious encirclement operation with an advance on Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar, ultimately from the Ocheretino positions, attacking the Ukrainians from their rear and cutting off their supplies. So a major battle playing out there. Now, that's all in itself very dramatic news, but we've had still more dramatic news, or at least important news, from the Kharkov direction. Now, it seems, and it's astonishing that this fact has not been revealed until now, but it seems that the Russians, at least since 2022, have been constructing a major airbase in the Belgorod area. And there's now satellite pictures which have appeared of it. They show a 1,800-meter runway, which is big, but by no means enormous. Many runways in air bases in the former Soviet Union have a length of more than 3,000 meters, just saying. But anyway, 1,800 meters is a substantial runway. It would enable Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers to operate, and probably all the other important Russian tactical aircraft, including Sukhoi 35s and Sukhoi 57s. Anyway, this runway is being built in Belgorod region, quite close to the conflict line. Now, I have to say that this, to my mind, opens up all kinds of questions concerning the attempted Ukrainian incursions in this precise area. The Ukrainian attempts to break through into Russian territory in Belgorod region. I'm not sure quite how close to this airbase those incursions were, but I wonder whether one of the purposes of these attacks by the Ukrainians was to disrupt Russian work on this airbase. Anyway, it looks as if the airbase has been almost completed. Its work on it began, apparently, as I said, in the summer of 2022. Indicative, by the way, of how long-term Russian planning has been. One assumes that this airbase is connected in some way to some larger Russian plan for the conduct of the war in Ukraine. And the fact that this airbase started to be built way back in the summer of 2022 points to a Russian plan which was intended to evolve over several years. Just saying. But anyway, there we go. A major airbase. And of course, the question is, what is this airbase going to be for? Now, Dima at the Military Summary channel yesterday said that the airbase is located too close to the contact line to be usable, that the Russians will have to push the Ukrainians back in order to be able to use this base. I presume what he means, that the airbase is within artillery range of the Ukrainian military. Now, that may be right, but the Russians have been conducting a major artillery and missile and drone operation of their own to knock out Ukrainian artillery and other facilities from the area of the border. And it could be that with the situation evolving as rapidly as it is, the Russians might decide that the airbase could be used to support operations, perhaps with heavy drones initially, who's to say? I mean, apparently the Russians are anticipating that by mid-year, heavy drones will be available in greater quantities. Weapons like the jet-powered S-70 Okhotnik drone, but perhaps also other drones like the Orion and Sirius drones, which are more like the Predators and the Reapers of the US military. It could be that these types of unmanned aircraft will be the ones that will be operating from this base, initially at least, and which could be deployed to the conflict zone. And of course, helicopters as well, and other things. But I, for one, can't help but think that the Russians wouldn't build an airbase like this if they didn't intend to use it. And the fact that they're intending to use it points, to my mind, to some kind of plan, long developed plan, to deal with the situation in Kharkov region, and probably to support airstrikes, to provide a base from which to carry out airstrikes on Ukrainian positions in Kharkov region and throughout the territory of northeastern Ukraine. Just saying. So, we'll see what happens. Bear in mind that if aircraft are operating close to their airbase, then they can take off, drop their bombs, fly back, get reloaded, bomb again, provided obviously there's no air defenses and no disruption from the artillery, Ukrainian artillery, but they can literally carry out round-the-clock bombing on a scale that would not be possible from an airbase located further away. So just making all of those points. We'll see how this plays out, and I'm not going to devote more time to discussing the precise details of this, because again, they lie outside my competence. But suffice to say that the fact that an airbase like this is in the process of being constructed and is apparently almost completed, that also, to my mind, strongly points to the prospects of a major Russian offensive in this area, in Kharkov region, sometime in late May, early June, exactly as the Ukrainians are saying. Now, the Western powers and the Ukrainians, of course, know about this airbase, have no doubt been following work on its construction for a long time, and I wonder whether this information that's been coming out from people like Budanov about this Russian offensive coming, whether that information is correlated to Russian work on the airbase, that Budanov and other Ukrainian intelligence and officials might be saying to each other that the fact that the Russians have now almost finished work on the airbase, that is the sign that the offensive is about to begin. When the work on the airbase was still underway, that perhaps indicated that the offensive still lay in the future, but now that the work on the airbase is almost completed, the attack is almost immediately coming. We'll see. Anyway, just to repeat, the fact that this airbase has been built and built where it is, to my mind, is a further reason to think that all of this talk of a Russian offensive in Kharkov region is not just a mirage, that there is a reality behind it. For the record, it seems that Kharkov city remains largely without electric power, or at least hundreds of thousands of residents in Kharkov city remain, as of now, without electric power. This isn't a story that's getting as much coverage as it should, in my opinion, but there it is. So that's my roundup of the situation on the battlefronts. There's lots of things going on in various places. Some people are surprised that the Russians haven't capitalized on their success in breaking into the village of Kislovka in the Kupiansk area to advance more rapidly. To my mind, that is simply consistent with the way the Russians do things. They seize opportunities when they appear. They noticed that the Ukrainian forces in Kislovka were depleting in number, and so they attacked and seized part of Kislovka. The Ukrainians rushed more forces there, and that meant that the Russians decided to stop, because their primary intention was not to capture Kislovka or Kotlerovka, the other village nearby, but to cause the Ukrainians to extend their lines and commit more of their already depleting reserves. So there we are. That's my summary of the situation on the battlefronts today. And as I said, it's bad news, and who knows, maybe the construction of this airbase is the worst news possible, but we shall see. Now, let's look at other things. The first is there are growing concerns in the United States about various weapon systems. And there was an article today in Defense One, one of these many military publications which exists in the United States. And as well as discussing further the failure of the small diameter guided rocket launched bomb, it also discloses that the Excalibur precision guided shells, which was supplied to Ukraine with, as I recall, an enormous amount of celebration. I think it was back in 2022 that they were going to make the Ukrainians enable the Ukrainians to carry out pinpoint strikes on the Russians, that they have failed completely. And the reason they have failed completely is because Russian jamming has reduced their effectiveness from 70% to 6%. And this has just happened over a few months as the Russians deployed more and more electronic warfare systems to the Ukrainian battlefronts. And it looks like the Excalibur also can't function effectively in a heavy electronic warfare environment. I get the sense that the HIMARS missiles are also losing their effectiveness. And, well, we see this with many other systems that the United States has supplied to Ukraine. There's been huge embarrassment about the Abrams tank, that it didn't achieve what many apparently expected that it would. Ukraine has pulled them out of the battlefronts, rubbing salt in the wounds. The Russians are apparently now intending to display a captured Abrams tank in the display in their exhibition of captured Western equipment that they're putting up in Moscow, timed to coincide with Russia's Victory Day celebrations. So anyway, lots of embarrassment about the failure of several Western weapon systems. But I think the biggest embarrassment and humiliation of all relates to the economic war. And we've now had a report in Britain from a House of Commons committee, and it's been discussed extensively in the Financial Times, the only place, by the way, in the British media where it has been discussed. But the title of the article reads, UK sanctions are failing to hamper Russia's economy, says senior MP. And we're then informed that the head of the United Kingdom's Treasury Select Committee, that's a committee of the House of Commons, has warned that Western sanctions against Russia are failing to hamper its economy. Dame Harriet Baldwin, Conservative chair of the committee, spoke out ahead of MPs launching oral evidence sessions to investigate the effectiveness of government designations against Moscow on Tuesday. In an interview with the Financial Times, Baldwin said there's a general consensus that sanctions are not working in terms of their stated intent, causing real trouble for the Russian economy. The IMF are forecasting Russia is going to be one of the strongest economies this year. The really serious thing is that the money is going into their defense budget to be used attacking Ukrainians. And then we're told that the committee's inquiry, due to report in July, has received written evidence from anti-corruption NGOs calling for the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, the UK sanctions enforcement body, to take a more robust approach towards punishing breaches. And then we're told an awful lot about enforcing sanctions, as if that is possible, by the way, for Britain to do on any significant scale. And then we're told that the US-led oil price cap on Russia's oil sales is obviously not really working terribly effectively, Baldwin noted. And Baldwin stressed that the UK should seek to improve the effectiveness of its sanctions regime, but identified industries where Britain has a global leadership role and could do more. The maritime and insurance sectors were two areas where the UK has a particular locus, where we could potentially come up with some tightening. Baldwin warned there were pressing questions about the effectiveness of the enforcement mechanisms. And anyway, there's also a further admission that as time passes, these sanctions become more difficult anyway to enforce and start to lose their effectiveness because the Russians can manage greater workarounds. Now, all of this is obvious, and it is obvious. Much of it also was obvious right from the start. On the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I discussed at length the oil price cap idea. I said that there was no prospect at all that it would succeed, that it was based on a complete misunderstanding of how maritime trade was conducted, that all that it would do would be to lead to a massive expansion in undercover trading in Russian oil, with flags being changed and tankers moving around and all kinds of middlemen doing incredibly well out of the way in which oil would be traded from this point onwards. I also said that given that the priority anyway on the part of the Western powers is to ensure that Russian oil continues to be supplied to global markets, it is completely inconceivable that any sanctions to try to control the price would, in the end, be effective, because that contradicts the objective, the purpose of sanctioning the Russian oil industry in the first place. All that the energy sanctions against Russia have done is that they have increased energy prices overall. Even if they've fallen from their 2022 peaks, almost certainly they're still significantly higher than they would otherwise be if those sanctions were not in place. And that is one amongst several reasons why inflation in the West is proving so sticky and why interest rates are remaining high. Anyway, all of this was predictable. It was also predictable that provided Russia absorbed the initial sanctions blow, that it would gradually, in fact, rapidly adapt to the sanctions. There was a possibility, or at least there was an arguable case in March 2022 that the sanctions shock might cause a major economic crisis in Russia. A lot depended on whether the policymakers in Russia held their nerve and took the right steps. If they'd misjudged the situation then things might have got out of control and the situation might have played out, economically speaking, rather in the way that Western governments thought that it might. But in the event, Russian policymakers held their nerve and took the right decisions, and the blow was absorbed. I would say that this is, in my opinion, very consistent with what I have seen of Russian governmental activity, not just in economic matters, but in foreign policy, in defense questions, in conduct of military affairs on the battlegrounds. It is sometimes possible to take the Russians by surprise. It is very difficult indeed to panic them. And attempts to panic them almost invariably fail. So Nabulina and the central bank chair, and Siluanov, the finance minister, and Reshetnikov, the economics minister, and Belousov, the deputy prime minister in overall charge of the economy, tough-minded, hands-on officials. They don't always agree with each other, but anyway, they all came together and responded to the sanctions in the spring and early summer of 2022, and the sanctions shock was absorbed. By June 2022, it ought to have become obvious to the West that the sanctions had failed, that the Russian economy was much more sophisticated, far more diversified, far better organized, far better managed than they realized, and that from that point onward, not only would the sanctions start to lose effectiveness, but that we would begin to see a steady return to economic growth. In fact, economic growth has surprised in Russia on the upside. Now, in 2022, Russia experienced a short recession. In 2023, it returned to growth, and the official GDP figure, which were maybe revised upwards, by the way, points to GDP growth in 2023 of 3.6%, wiping out the effects of the recession in 2022. We've now had official figures for GDP growth in the first quarter of 2024, and they come out at 5.4%. Both Nabulina, the central bank chair, and Putin have delivered reports about the state of the economy. They both say that economic activity remains extremely strong. They both point to the continuation of an investment boom. And Putin specifically has said that the forecast, the GDP forecast for this year, is likely going to have to be revised upwards, and it's beginning to look as if Russia will achieve at least 3% GDP growth this year, possibly even more than that. So, strong economic performance in Russia, and all driven by a major boom in investment. Now, some people have been clutching at some comments that Nabulina, the central bank chair, has been making recently about the situation in the Russian economy. She has said that the economy is growing faster than the central bank anticipated, that the effect of that is that inflation is likely to turn out higher this year than the central bank had forecast. So, whereas the original forecast was that inflation by the end of this year would be between 4.4% and 4.5%, it could be somewhat higher than that, and the range that the central bank now estimates for inflation is 4.3 to 4.8%. Now, I've seen a lot of reports. There was one long one in the Daily Telegraph about how this is a huge blow to Putin, and that the central bank is admitting that inflation in Russia is going to be higher than previously predicted. But to be completely frank, I think that from Putin's point of view, an inflation rate that is in a range of 4.3 to 4.8%, if that's what we get, is not going to be such a problem by comparison with an inflation rate previously forecast at between 4 and 4.5%. He probably does want interest rates lower sooner, but the point is that inflation, the rate at which prices are growing, is declining. Now, it's important to stress that we're talking about the rate at which prices are growing. Prices are not falling. Russian consumers have had to absorb the blow of the higher inflation, around 7 to 8%, that Russia experienced last year and in the early months of this year. But it does seem as that inflation peak has passed, and since wages in Russia have been growing faster than inflation, it looks as if the problems for Russians of the higher rises last year, well, they have been an inconvenience, no doubt, especially for those on fixed incomes, but they've not been a major blow for the economy as a whole. So, higher growth. Nabulina admits that with the investment boom, there's a possibility, she's always very careful about saying that it's a certainty, there's a possibility that the economy is moving towards a higher growth trajectory anyway, because capacity is improving, higher growth overall, and growth focused very much in the productive parts of the economy, in manufacturing and industry, where rates of growth in many cases are at double-digit levels. In other words, an economy that is gradually changing its center of gravity from services and consumption to one focused more on manufacturing and production, but all driven by a very substantial consumer market. Now, all of this probably taken together with the fact that we've had rather higher energy prices this year, quite likely means that there is going to be, if not a budget surplus as such, though that's not impossible, at least an easing in the overall position of the Russian budget. The Russian budget last year had a deficit of just under 2% of GDP, nominal GDP. Probably going to be less this year. But anyway, there is plenty of funds available in Russia for infrastructure spending, and that apparently is proceeding. There's all kinds of ambitious plans to build more roads, more railways, to develop high-speed rail, very high-speed rail, rail achieving Japanese and Chinese levels of speed rather than European levels of speed. Just saying, difference between trains moving at 250 kilometers an hour, as some of them do currently in Russia, and going up to 400 kilometers an hour, as they might do before long. Anyway, lots of plans like that. And overall, a fairly stable situation in the economy overall. The ruble, by the way, has remained relatively stable over the last few months. And with respect to inflation, 4.3 to 4.8% inflation, if that is indeed what Russia has, may seem a lot in the West. But the central bank has always had a target of 4%. inflation. They've always said that given Russia's current state of development and the need for the economy to develop and grow, Russia needs to accept a higher level of inflation than mature economies like those in Europe would accept, because spending on infrastructure, on capital investment, and indeed on consumption to support production needs to be higher in order to enable the economy to grow faster and to develop faster. I remember Nabiullina saying this very thing, explaining how the central bank had calculated that a 4% inflation rate was the optimal inflation rate for Russia. A lower inflation would lower growth to unacceptably low levels. Higher inflation be above that would start to seriously impact living standards and would distort development. I remember hearing Nabiullina saying that very thing and explaining how the central bank had come to that very calculation on one of the only two occasions that I've actually seen her in the flesh, in an audience, as part of an audience in a session I attended at the St. Petersburg, one of the meetings of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum some years ago. So, to reiterate again, 4% inflation continues to be the target. It'll be slightly higher than that this year, according to the central bank, but coming closer, and we're starting to see, or in fact we are seeing, as the British Treasury Select Committee admits, higher growth. Now, I make all of these points, and I'm labouring them again, because it's important to say that the Treasury Committee, at least Dame Baldwin, is talking here about the performance of the civilian economy. Obviously, the surge in military production that we have seen, and Putin says that this has now reached around 6% of GDP. The surge in military production, which continues, is contributing to the higher GDP growth figures. But it is a fundamental error to see it as the main reason for this economic growth. Economic growth is down to higher investment. Central Bank Chair Nabiullina says that. Others within the Russian economic leadership are saying the same thing. We are seeing a general upswing which is affecting every part of the economy. The closest parallel would be with what happened to the US economy during the American Civil War of the 1860s, and which happened again during the Second World War in the 1940s. The Second World War, the US Second World War economy, grew at a much faster pace than the Russian economy is growing today, because it did so in part as a rebound from the Depression of the 1930s, and of course it actually did operate as a war economy. And the US economy at that period, the 1940s, not only witnessed extremely impressive growth, but of course inflation during that period was also quite high. But eventually, over the course of the 1940s, everything settled down, inflation fell, the investment surge of the 1940s nonetheless created the conditions for further sustained growth, which continued for the next 20 years. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to see in Russia anything quite as dramatic as that, but that's the kind of change we are seeing, always with the understanding that we're not looking at a war economy such as the one the United States ran in the 1940s. So there it is. An admission in Britain from the Treasury Select Committee that the sanctions have failed. Still talk, notice, about tightening up the sanctions in some way. No idea or explanation of how that is going to be done or what difference that is going to make. The idea that Britain still has leadership in maritime matters and insurance. Well, that was true 20 years ago. It is no longer true today. Both China and Russia, and by the way, India as well, perfectly capable of sorting out their own maritime insurance and legal issues. They don't need London in the way that they once did. Even Dame Harriet Baldwin says it. She says it slipped out in this interview with the Financial Times. The longer sanctions, I'm quoting directly from her very words, the longer sanctions are in place, the more ways people find to get round them, and it's pretty obvious that patterns of trade are changing to allow exactly that. Now, if that is not a straightforward admission of failure, then what is? Is it going to change British government policy? No. Is it going to change American government policy? No. Is it going to change the policy of the European Union? The European Union, after all, is suffering heavily from the economic war. I discussed, I think it was yesterday in my program, how the PMI figures for manufacturing in Germany are terrible. They're down to 42, where 50, anything above 50 points to an expansion, and anything below 50 points to a contraction. So we're going to see a further manufacturing recession in Germany over the next few months, at least. Obviously, all connected with the situation in the sanctions war. But is that going to cause any change of direction? The answer again is no. Olaf Scholz will not change course, nor, if he replaces Scholz, will Boris Pistorius, Germany's defense minister, nor if there is a reshuffling of the format of the German coalition and the Christian Democrats join and their leader, Friedrich Merz, becomes the new chancellor. Well, no, that's not going to cause either any change in German economic policy. The sanctions must remain in place, even though they have failed, and they have visibly failed, and going back to what Dame Harriet Baldwin says, the IMF are forecasting Russia's going to be one of the strongest economies this year. I understand that later today, the RAND Corporation is going to publish what I suspect is going to be one of the most momentous reports that it has published over the last few years. One which acknowledges that the United States is in decline and which is warning that unless steps are taken soon to reverse that decline, then that decline will accelerate and will become irreversible. Now, I don't want to anticipate that report until I see it, but there are comments about it, and apparently it's been discussed in the American media, and David Ignatius, the Washington Post reporter who has read it, already has a rather anxious article in the Washington Post about it. How do you expect to reverse decline if you continue to pile on one mistake after the other, and even when the reality of that mistake is there, staring at you in the face, even when you get your own experts, your own, in the case of Britain, Treasury Select Committee, to tell you that you've made a mistake? Well, you just go on with that mistake and intensify and redouble it and accelerate it. I just don't know what to say sometimes in this. The whole point about democracies is that because there was supposed to be open debate, they were supposed to be self-correcting. They were able to look at facts, people were able to argue about them, and when visible and obvious mistakes were made, course corrections could be undertaken. And that had an element of truth about it as well. Well, not anymore, it would seem. As I said, I'm going to discuss that Rand Corporation report when it appears. But for the moment, at least, if the United States and its allies, Britain, are indeed in a position of decline, the impulse from our leaders is not to put the foot on the brakes and to stop and think and try to turn the car round. It is to put the foot on the accelerator instead. Well, there we are. That's all I'm going to say for this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find all the amazing things that we have, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.